Henry. I run Rebel Stitchers, which is not your grandma's fiber and art store. We do things differently here, and we try out different techniques and experiment, and it's lots and lots of fun. And today is episode 2 of Fiber Diaries. We're going to be making up some 1% stock solutions of my different acid dyes. Some of them are brand new, some of them were gifted to me by a lovely lady that I bought my drum carder from. I have no idea how old they are. Some of them seem like they might be a little bit too old, or that liquid had gotten in there, so they got a little clumpy. We'll see how it goes. We'll see if I'm able to mix them up into stock solutions, but I would really like to do that because I'm not a huge fan of working with the powder itself, because I don't like having to wear all the personal protective gear that comes with that. And I am a messy person, and I tend to make messes with it much easier and not catch it as easy as I do with using it in a solution. I can see it much easier. So let's go make some stock solutions and I'll explain to you how I do it. Let's go to my kitchen. All right, so we're about to get pretty nerdy and mathy in here, and I just noticed you can see tons of my fleeces back here. Those have all been washed, but they need to be combed, carded, pulled into roving, dyed. So as you can see, we're going to have lots of things going on here on the channel, but that'll come later. That'll come later. Today, we're talking the math of fiber dyeing. And I did want to say that even though I'm going to be throwing a ton of information at you, I have created a cheat sheet, as you can see here. It's available for download on my website. I'll put the link in the description. And what you'll do is click the link, go to the website, click buy. It's priced to $0, but that's just how I can get it where you can download it. So just letting you know that while you might want to take notes, there is a little cheat sheet that I did put together. So what is a stock solution? And I guess I'm going to give you my version of a stock solution and what I'm talking about here. So when I'm talking about a stock solution, I'm talking about a set amount of acid dyes per 100 milliliters of water. To make math easier, I just do per 100 milliliters of water. And we'll get into this in a little bit, but that's kind of my starting point. So that's what I'm referencing. So the most common stock solutions that I personally use are 1% and 2%. Sometimes I'll go into the 3 or 4. Anything over that, it's really hard to exhaust. So I try to stick with 1 or 2. That's normally where I'm at with the percentages. But like I said, there are some colors that I do pump up that color some more, because a 1% stock solution of, say, a black is going to be much darker than even like a 3% stock solution of like a light gray. I'm trying to think of the name of Jacquard's light gray, but it's evading me at the moment. So depending on which color you're working with, you might want a higher percentage of the stock solution. So what does the 1% or 2% refer to? So it refers to the depth of shade, or DOS. You see it listed as DOS a lot. I did make this little graphic for you to show that the higher the depth of shade, the more saturated the color is, and the lower the depth of shade, the less saturated the color is to itself, not compared to other colors. Keep that in mind. For a 1% depth of shade stock solution, what I'm referring to, because I like to refer to 100 milliliters of water, is 1 gram of dye per 100 milliliters of water. That gives us a 1% dye to water ratio. And here is the formula to find that out. So the stock solution concentration percentage is 100 times the weight of dye in grams divided by 100 milliliters of water. So to do a 1% stock solution, you take 100 times 1 gram of dye divided by 100 milliliters, and you get 1 gram of dye for 1%. So how is this related to the depth of shade? So to figure out the depth of shade percentage, you want to take 100 times the weight of dye in grams divided by the weight of fiber in grams. Because depending on how much fiber you're wanting to dye, that's going to change how much dye you need in order to get the same depth of shade. So if you're dyeing, say, 10 grams of fiber, you're going to need less dye to get that same depth of shade than you would if you were saying dyeing 500 grams of fiber. Because there's more fiber, it takes more dye to cover that same depth of shade. Another way to look at it is the depth of shade times the fiber in grams divided by the stock solution that you're using. So let's say that I have a 1% stock solution and I need to dye 400 grams of fiber to a 4% depth of shade. So I want this really, really saturated color. So what we would do, the easy calculation is to figure out the 1% depth of shade. And we already know that 1 gram of dye to 100 grams of fiber will give us a 1% depth of shade. So if we need a 4%, then we just multiply that times 4. So 4 grams of dye to 100 grams of fiber will bump it up from 1% to 4. But we have 400 grams of fiber that we need to dye. So we're going to multiply that 4 times 400 and divide that by 1 gram of dye per 100 milliliters of water. So 4 grams of dye divided by 100 grams of fiber gives us 0.04. We're going to multiply that times 400 grams of fiber because that's the total amount of fiber that we need to dye. And then divide it by 1 gram of dye per 100 milliliters of our stock solution. So that gives us 16 grams divided by 0.01. Yes. So that gives us 16 grams of dye divided by 0.01 because 1 divided by 100 is 0.01. And that gives us 1,600 milliliters. So that 4% depth of shade on 400 grams of fiber, we're going to need 1,600 milliliters. Whereas if we were doing 4% depth of shade on 100 grams of fiber, we would just need 400 milliliters of the 1% stock solution. So as you can see, sometimes it takes a large quantity of that 1% stock solution because it's just a 1% depth of shade. So if you do know that you have a more saturated color that you're trying to get to, it might be worth it to start with a higher percentage stock solution depth of shade. So instead of starting with like 1, we could start with 2. Instead of starting with 2, we could start with 3. And that makes the volume of the stock solution that you need less because there's more grams of dye within that stock solution. So for a 1% depth of shade stock solution, we need 1 gram of dye per 100 milliliters of water. And the container that I'm going to be showing you in a minute will hold 170 milliliters of water. So to figure out what I need to make a 1% stock solution, we're going to take the weight of dye in grams divided by 100 milliliters of water, like we talked about before, times 100. Because we know 1 gram of dye to 100 milliliters of water gives us the 1%. But mine's more than that. So we need to figure out what grams of dye we need because we do have more volume of water. So for a 1% depth of shade for this 170 milliliters of water, we need 1 gram of dye times 170 milliliters of water divided by 100 milliliters of water because 1 gram of dye into 100 milliliters gives us 1%. So we need 1.7 grams of dye per 170 milliliters of water. I hope this makes sense. So it's hard to explain, but just know that if you do 100 times 1 gram of dye times whatever milliliters of water that your container holds, and then divide it by 100 milliliters, that will give you your 1% stock solution. If you were doing like a 2% depth of shade, you would do 100 times 2 grams of dye times whatever the water is divided by 100 milliliters, and so forth and so on. 3 grams, a 3% stock solution would be 3 grams of dye times whatever milliliters of water divided by 100 milliliters of water. I hope this makes sense. It's much easier as you're doing it to start seeing what I'm talking about. So we are finally in my kitchen. I'm so sorry that it took that long, but I had to get through that math portion in order for you guys to understand what I'm doing. So I'm setting my container here on the scale and zeroing it out so it doesn't count the weight of the container. And I'm going to be measuring out 1.7 grams of dye to make the 1% stock solution, because remember, my containers will hold 170 milliliters of water, so we need 1.7 grams of acid dyes in order to make a 1% stock solution. So for each stock solution, I'm going to be using a different spoon, making sure my gloves are nice and dry. That way we don't introduce any liquid or water into the dry powder. And I also want to state that everything used with the acid dyes are for dyeing only. They're not used in the preparation of food. I'm also wearing my personal protective gear. I've got on a mask and gloves and goggles, even though you can't see those. Well, they're actually safety glasses, but same difference. So I'm taking some of the water and mixing it with the 1.7 grams of dye to make a slurry here, and as the particles get incorporated, I'm just adding a little bit more and a little bit more water, just to make sure that everything gets nice and incorporated together. And so I've got my container here with my funnel to make it a little bit easier to pour it in, because the mouths of these containers are pretty small. So I've got my paper towels handy in case I spill anything, because I'm a klutz and I know that I will spill it. So I've got my 1% stock solution here, and we're going to put it into the bottle. And I'm stopping every now and then to just stir a little bit more, making sure that I got all of that dye that I can mixed up into the solution. There'll be a little bit of dye left over. You can save that, add some more water to it, and use it in another dye project. I try my best not to waste dye, so that's one thing that I do is try to use up any dye that's left over. And here's my squeeze bottle lid here. And one thing that I will note is that while I love these bottles, I love the size, they are not spill proof. They will spill. So I've got my label on. This was Jacquard Periwinkle 1% stock solution, and I make sure to add the date to it so I have an idea of how old the dye is. So we were able to make almost all of the dyes into stock solutions. I didn't record all of it because it was just the same thing over and over and over. I just really wanted to teach you how I make my 1% stock solutions, because it will make it easier for you if you decide that you want to start dyeing, to make more recipes that you can recreate. Kind of, if nothing else. But making the stock solutions are great if you are wanting to make a lot of one specific colorway. It kind of helps you be consistent and have that consistency and have a starting point. You may change things up. You may decide that you want a 2% or a 0.5%. Whatever works for you, but it gives you a starting point and a way to be more consistent. So thank you so much for watching. Make sure to subscribe, comment, like, all of the good stuff, and I'll see you in the next episode of Fiber Diaries. Don't forget to go to rebelstitchers.com, hit the digital downloads, and download your copy of the fiber dyeing math cheat sheet. Just hit add to cart, go through the checkout process, and you'll be able to download it. Or you can follow the link below in the description, and it'll take you directly to this page. Then you'll add it to the cart and check out. Thank you so much for watching.